Well, we look forward to a very dynamic exchange with our two expert panels today. And with that, I will turn it over to NBR's Executive Vice President, Michael Wills. Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Audrey, and thank you all for taking the time to join us today for this important discussion. As we look at the regional trade environment, it's become extremely complex over a number of years. And I think based on some of the research that we've been doing here at NBR, I would posit that there are four broad trends that are shaping things right now. The first is obviously an intensifying competition between the United States and China, part of which has played out in the trade domain. And we saw this during the last few years with disputes over tariffs, export controls, investment restrictions, and things like this. Secondly, the pandemic that we're living through and hopefully coming toward the end of has also created significant uncertainties in the regional trade landscape, calling into question the viability and resiliency of supply chains. And I think that's caused a lot of countries and companies to reassess how they think about trade and procuring the goods that they need. And then thirdly, we're seeing an upsurge in digital trade and digital technologies, data privacy, a new form of economic activity that has not been fully captured and covered during a lot of the regulations and frameworks that exist to govern trade, and some very different visions for how best to do that between some of the key actors, whether that be the United States or the EU or China. And then fourthly, and from my perspective as more of a sort of international relations focused person than a trade person, the relative absence of the United States as a voice leading regional trade in the Indo-Pacific over the last 5 or 6 years. So the withdrawal of the United States from TPP and its relative absence since then in regional trade discussions has created a bit of a gap that I think we will talk about today, and it's allowed other countries to have more space to express their visions. And the net effect of all of this is a very high level of uncertainty, both at a policy level for governments as they're trying to navigate their existing trade and investment relationships with the United States, with China, with their other major partners, and especially for businesses that are now dealing with a much more uncertain landscape and a much more complex environment in which to make their long-term decisions. So as Audrey mentioned, we'll unpack some of these issues through 2 panel discussions today. We'll begin the first one actually with some key remarks from a counselor here at NBR, Charles Boustany, who I'll introduce in just a moment. And Charles will then moderate our first panel, and then we'll move into a second panel. And after each of those panel discussions, there will be an opportunity for audience Q&A. But let me introduce Charles to begin with. A 6-term member of Congress representing the state of Louisiana. Charles served on the House Ways and Means Committee, co-chaired the US-China Working Group, co-chaired the Japan Caucus, a real leader in the House on trade issues. And it was during that time that we at NBR began to work with him as an advisor on some of our energy and trade related work. We've been delighted since his retirement from public service that he's been able to spend some time working as a counselor to NBR, very involved in our trade center activities, and has co-authored a number of pieces with Aaron Friedberg, with Rich Ellings, with others here at NBR on a wide range of trade issues. And so I'm going to turn now to Charles Boustany and have him make opening remarks, and we'll kick the session off. Charles, over to you.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be with you. And this is truly an important topic. And I appreciate the opportunity to offer some opening comments, really some reflections on competing visions for Indo-Pacific trade. Clearly, developments in the Indo-Pacific, and especially in trade, are evolving very rapidly as competing views have now emerged among nations over the past 5 years, 5 to 6 years, I should say. Policy uncertainty, ongoing trends affecting trade and investment, how nations respond to these challenges resulting from the uncertainty that's ensuing will determine whether competition will lead to further liberalization of trade or a descent into trading blocks or even deeper protectionism. What I'm going to do with my remarks is focus first on 5 ongoing trends that I see in Indo-Pacific trade, followed by some very general remarks about the current state of US trade policy. So with regard to trends, First and foremost, and it comes as no surprise, U.S.-China strategic competition is significant. The trade war that began a few years ago has had spill-on effects, which along with the pandemic brought on certainly a proliferation of protectionism around the world. We've certainly seen supply chain disruptions and elements of economic nationalism rising in different areas. The second trend is hedging by countries in the region. Countries in the region and in fact worldwide are reluctant about being placed in a position of having to choose between the United States and China. Countries in the Asia-Pacific region in particular have China as a leading trade partner, yet they may have them look to the US for security, and they seek to avoid running afoul of either country. In fact, I just read a commentary published on June 11th of this year by Ashley Townsend and Susanna Patton over in Australia at the United States Studies Center in Sydney. And they stated in this commentary that most Indo-Pacific nations are skeptical about endorsing the Biden administration's value-based strategy, even though they're concerned about Chinese power. Townsend and Patton go on to recommend that the United States should de-emphasize making reluctant nations choose between democratic and authoritarian systems, and instead shift its mindset from competition between systems to competition for influence regardless of the system. In other words, trying to align interest is really what the competition will be about. Specifically, they go on to add that 4 years after withdrawing from what was known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the United States must signal that it plans to contribute to and benefit from the region's economic growth. So the economic presence of the United States is something that is missed in this region. And it's something that needs to be more of a focus from the standpoint of US policymakers. The third trend is the ongoing global value chain restructuring. Global value chain restructuring has been underway for some time, driven by economic fundamentals. That certainly was the case before the trade war and the pandemic. But now businesses are having to react as they contend with policy uncertainty, geopolitical risk, rising protectionism, risk associated with geographic concentration and disruptions. Global value chain restructuring also has been tending toward regionalization and away from globalization. So this is an important trend to watch. The fourth trend is the growing importance of digital trade and digital trade agreements. The expansion of the digital economy is a major driver of global value chain development. And this is especially the case for small and mid-sized firms. But there are divergent views on digital trade and data governance with significant implications for the future of the digital economy and certainly for small and mid-sized firms. The extent to which standards allow liberalized cross-border data flows as envisaged by countries like Japan, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore, or whether it's a call for data localization and data sovereignty as envisaged by China, India, and Russia. Either way, the impact on global value chains and the digital economy will be substantial. Also, we can't discount the important position of the EU. The EU is more engaged now in the Asia-Pacific region, and their views on privacy are at variance with other views, whether it's the United States or China, in this regard, and these views cannot be discounted in this competition. The two major regional trade agreements that have been put together, whether it's the CPTPP, which has set new global benchmarks for high standards, or RCEP, which is less ambitious in that carve-outs for national security and government data are broad and thus limit cross-border data flows. These are important, and there will be competition emerging between these two regional agreements, even though there's significant overlap among countries involved. But in the RCEP, there's also these non-discrimination provisions meant to open markets to foreign tech companies that are very, very weak, as opposed to CPTPP. So this is going to be another area that we have to watch as it pertains to digital trade. Also, there's a newer development There's a lot of talk about sectoral agreements, and digital trade is one area where sectoral agreements are underway. It's a newer development. Just to mention a few, the US-Japan Digital Trade Agreement certainly outlines a shared vision of the two countries, but it's not enforceable. It's not ratified, but it could be more widely adopted if the US were to join CPTPP. Similarly, there's another agreement, Singapore-Australia Digital Economy Agreement. It's a high-level agreement. It is binding. It could serve as a template for high standards if more widely adopted. And then there's another interesting digital trade agreement. It's the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement between Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand, which offers a new approach, a modular framework, which could serve as an impetus for more innovation in approaches that build on flexibility and adaptability. A modular framework could cover emerging technologies as they become adopted. But this agreement lacks enforceability at this time, but it's an interesting development that bears watching. And it remains to be seen whether sectoral agreements ultimately will supplant more comprehensive trade and investment agreements as new technology emerges and competition intensifies. And then the fifth trend I want to mention is the proliferation of preferential trade agreements in the region. The Asia-Pacific region continues as the largest contributor to worldwide preferential trade agreements, with 184 currently in force, 19 that are signed and pending ratification, and 95 under negotiation right now. 49% of these involve countries outside of the region, and 8 out of the last 17 that were signed between 2019 and 2020 have specific e-commerce provisions. So this, I think, this is a very active area for trade, which is going to set standards more broadly for the rest of the world. I mentioned earlier CPTPP and RCEP, which are the two largest agreements, with CPTPP setting higher standards. But at its very fundamental core, the Indo-Pacific region is the hotbed for competition among views that will determine the future course for trade, investment, global value chain development, legal and technical standards. The region is a global focus for competition between whether there'll be further economic integration and how that integration will occur with rising standards, or will there be rising economic nationalism and further protectionism? The big unknown in all of this is American foreign economic policy and how policymakers in the US will ultimately use economic statecraft. This remains an outstanding question and a very important one. The Biden administration has been reluctant to roll back tariffs imposed by the previous administration and has not offered a plan for entering preferential trade agreements. And in fact, at midnight tonight, June 30th, Trade Promotion Authority expires. And without Trade Promotion Authority, the pathway to moving forward with preferential trade agreements, or really a trade agenda in general, becomes much more difficult. Our allies don't take us seriously in negotiations, and this becomes a big problem. The question is, what is the president's vision for Trade Promotion Authority and for the trade agenda? Right now, what we know is that there are a series of reviews ongoing, with the first of the two-part supply chain review having been released. These are being conducted, and along with all these other reviews, to implement a so-called worker-centric trade policy. However, the emphasis seems to be solely on enforcement of existing agreements rather than new agreements. The United States is clearly risking diminished influence in the competition for setting standards for trade, investment, and technology by delaying formal engagement in the region. In fact, the last ratified agreement, a bilateral trade agreement with South Korea, was negotiated during the Bush administration, ratified during the Obama administration after some modifications. Formal economic engagement has not kept pace. US formal economic engagement has not kept pace with developments in the Indo-Pacific. I'll conclude my remarks there. And Michael, do you want to introduce the panel?
Sure. Thank you so much, Charles, for laying out the context there much more fully. We're going to have a couple folks join Charles now. Etel Solingen, who's a professor at the University of California down in Irvine, has done a lot of work on supply chains and regional international political economy. So she will be making some remarks, as will Nigel Cory. Nigel is the Associate Director of Trade Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, but in a previous life worked at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So delighted to have those two speakers join Charles. This will be a three-person conversation among the three of them for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll conclude panel one and shift across to panel two.
Great, thank you, Michael, and welcome to our two panelists, Etel and Cory. Let's jump right into questions. So, looking at regional countries, how are they looking to respond to these changes, this evolution in digital trade and supply chain development, and their respective trade policies? And then furthermore, are there any shifts or trends that are really underappreciated in all of this? So, Cory, you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So I think the central point of differentiation in terms of what shapes sort of regional dynamics as it relates to trade, you touched on, and that's sort of the opposing, well, not opposing, but the particular model sort of advocated by China as it relates to digital trade, digital economy, and tech governance. And China takes a very controlled centric approach to these issues. And that's sort of, and that's because of overriding concerns about national and regime security. And from that defines their ability to advocate for their approach internationally. And so what that has meant, as in RCEP, is that in e-commerce and digital trade, they basically don't make any commitments as it relates to data and digital products. RCEP's provisions on those issues were essentially sort of meaningless and unenforceable. And so it largely means that they're advocating for small package e-commerce issues. In contrast, the other countries and other initiatives that you already highlighted, advocated by Australia, Singapore, Japan, and New Zealand, that advocate a vision for shared governance of how do we maximize the trade, economic, and societal benefits of digital technologies while working together to address the shared risks, and recognizing that they still obviously need to account for data privacy, national security, and other concerns, but that doesn't preclude them from engaging internationally, and that they can address those issues in a targeted and proportionate way. And that's the model they represent. And I think it's you made a really good point there about the attraction of these alternative models, in that these countries, and by these countries I mean sort of Singapore, Australia, Chile, and New Zealand, who are prosecuting these digital economy agreements, are doing this because they recognize that as small and medium-sized economies, they need to build digital economies of scale through these agreements. They don't have the natural size of the US and China, so they have no choice but to go out and engage with their partners and set the rules of the road that ensure their firms have digital access. And I think that's a key differentiator that other countries will be attracted to as they look to China's model versus sort of this alternative sort of still very early and nascent model as to what approach they want to take to ensure that their firms can engage in sort of the global digital economy. And I'll leave it at there to start off, and I'll hand it over to Etel.
Etel, over to you.
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you to NBR for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here. And Charles, your remarks were very comprehensive and really set the stage for the conversation today. I have some brief remarks to address narrowly the global value chain dimension of this, global value chains being the technical term used, especially in economics, to address global design, production, and supply networks. I can do that right now just to set up sort of the general context for individual countries' reactions to this particular issue. So
Please do. Yes, I should say I meant to provide you each with time to speak before we jumped into questions. I jumped the gun, so please proceed.
but virtually everything you said really leads into some of, you will see into some of the things I have here. So first of all, events since 2018, I think, provide some form of a natural experiment for gauging the role of GDCs in the international relations of the Indo-Pacific. The pre-existing GVC infrastructure came, as we all know, under stress, and interstate tensions have escalated beyond anything we've seen in recent decades. Now, these geopolitical tensions have introduced unprecedented mega risks into GVC operations. My remarks, I don't know if you can actually see my PowerPoint presentation there. Yeah. So my remarks draw on this particular book that literally just appeared with Cambridge University Press, which addresses more directly the interaction between the international relations of the region and the GVC infrastructure that underpins the international relations of the region. But for the purposes of this particular presentation, I will discuss the following points very briefly. If you can move to the next slide. Very briefly, what's at stake, a very brief evolution of GVC interdependence in East Asia. How has uncertainty affected GVCs at the macro-micro level? Charles Boustany mentioned uncertainty several times in his overarching remarks, because I think it is a central issue even now. Third, how have firms responded to this context, and some brief conclusions. So next, what's at stake? This figure shows the impressive evolution of regional sourcing of parts and components by China, that's in red, the US in blue, and other Asia-Pacific countries in green. China's share is particularly remarkable, both as imported from and supplier to the region. Among procurements from East Asian countries, those sourced from China are bounded by those dotted lines in the diagrams, if you can see them. Next, now again, Charles mentioned uncertainty, and I think this is a critical component of where we are and where we've been and where we are. How has uncertainty engendered by the US-China tensions affected GVCs? This graph from a study by Ahir et al. Shows you very vividly the spike in uncertainty since 2018. It begins with the 1990s, and you can see the spike since 2018. The trade and tech disputes have affected 88% of GVCs in some fashion by forcing shifts to alternative markets or disrupting payments or access to utilities, increasing cyber attacks and espionage, limiting access to raw materials, and several other mechanisms that we explore in that book. The next slide shows you yet another uptick in uncertainty under COVID-19, which was superimposed on the uncertainty engendered by US-China tensions. Now, it's not just US-China, it's also Japan, South Korea, etc. Fortunately, there has been a dramatic decline in uncertainty under the Biden administration, but we're not yet over that phase, but a dramatic decline nonetheless. Next, how have firms responded to US-China tensions? Again, I can't go into details in my allocated time, but let me highlight just the top one. 66% of the firms polled deemed decoupling to be an impossible thing in 2019, but only 44% in 2020. And I can come back to this slide during Q&As if anybody is interested in other effects that are reflected in those surveys. Next slide is what are the strategies that firms have embraced thus far. Again, let me just highlight a couple. First, building resilience through automation, digitalization, diversification, just in case, capacity buffers, regionalization, nearshoring, shorter GVCs, the whole menu. This is actually happening. Second, most firms retained the in China for China strategy, meaning about 80% had no plans to relocate out of China in 2018 prior to the big rise in uncertainty. But it's actually higher. It's 85% by late 20, meaning 85% are not considering relocation out of China, according to the survey. There are various surveys included in this brief overview. However, 96% of US-based companies and 100% of Europe-based companies listed China as one of their top 3 sourcing countries in 2019. That declined to 77 and 80% by March of 2021, meaning, again, fewer companies see China as one of their top 3 sourcing countries. Some of the conclusions, we can move to the next slide, and I'll end with that one, that the book comes up with is that GVCs amplify the impact of geopolitical shocks upstream and downstream, which is part of the problem. But GVCs also help mitigate them, so they're also part of the solution. Firms' investment in resilience is real. 87% of the companies surveyed in one important survey, 1,346 firms, are actually engaged in buttressing resilience. And reshoring is hardly the standard GVC response thus far. There does not seem to be a GVC bifurcation as of now. And indeed, Jonathan Austri, the deputy director of the IMF's Asia and Pacific department, found little evidence of bifurcation of Asian GVCs into sort of parallel structures aligned respectively with US or China spheres of influence. There does seem to be a trend to China's partial potential decline as factory of the world, but hardly its demise. Diversification has taken the form of a China plus one or China plus many strategy, where China's domestic market remains a very powerful source of attraction, but adding other countries softens extreme dependence on China. So all this suggests that a revised, but far from obsolescing GVC infrastructure is emerging throughout the region. And indeed, it's possible that a more resilient infrastructure might emerge from these shocks. However, and I'll end with this remark, weaponization and coercive statecraft, which Charles also mentioned, are two-way streets. So Xi Jinping's dual circulation policies and some preliminary US responses continue to fuel some uncertainty. Again, Charles mentioned Biden's 100-day report and supply chain resilience. All of these things could unleash changes that we're unable to predict yet. There is then a non-trivial likelihood that geopolitics, tech competition, and the legacy of COVID-19 might unleash even more sizable disruptions in the global geography of production. Now, much more in the book on GVCs and technology, artificial intelligence, US domestic politics, China domestic politics, labor, etc., the smartphone industry and other topics. But I'm going to stop here, and thanks again.
Thank you, Etel. Cory, I want to go back to you. I mean, I may have denied you the opportunity to make opening comments. Is that, if so, please do.
Now, I suppose I'll just, I mean, you did such a great job of sort of highlighting some of the key issues in that digital really is the focus of the region in many initiatives that's going on there. And I think what's going on there makes your point about sort of lack of clear US vision and engagement particularly stark, in that the countries, and so in this way, I think the Indo-Pacific is particularly interesting because it's highlighting sort of this experimentation with shared sort of digital trade governance. And it's a model that I think appeals to a greater range of countries and regions around the world, because it accounts for the fact that it has a diverse membership of developing and developed countries, and takes into account that countries can be at different levels of development, but they want to play a role in sort of setting the rules around digital trade in their area. And that I mention that because that's a very different sort of basis of engagement as per the European approach to digital governance, which is essentially strict adherence to the harmonization of its privacy laws. And that essentially dictates their ability to engage or not engage in digital trade. And I think while obviously the European Union has signed recent agreements with Korea and Japan and agreed to adequacy determinations in both cases, that in their FTAs with Vietnam and Singapore, there's nothing on digital, nothing on data. And so I think that's particularly interesting in that if Europe can't come to an agreement with Singapore, which is a world leader in this area, then just how many countries around the world can Europe sort of work with on this? So whereas I think what Australia, Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore are doing with their digital trade agreements, economy agreements, I should say, is far more flexible in that they combine legally binding and enforceable commitments on well-known digital trade issues, such as forced local data storage, data localization, along with soft commitments to cooperate on emerging regulatory issues via MOUs, which means that these agreements can adjust to the changing nature of digital trade, technology, and regulatory requirements. And what this shows is that these digital economy agreements are living agreements. They're not just one and done, as in traditional trade agreements. And they provide a level of flexibility and accessibility to building sort of interoperable regulatory approaches between digital economies at varying levels. And you briefly mentioned the Chile, Singapore, New Zealand Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, which I think is particularly interesting because while parts of its model, these modular sort of issues it does, are actually open to anyone that wants to sign up to their level of ambition. And they're particularly interesting because they're covering off on both trade and non-trade related issues in that it covers AI, data flows, digital identities, e-invoicing, data innovation and regulatory sandboxes, and a range of other issues that have a trade implication. And they're particularly interesting because it's essentially a recognition that whatever approach they take to these issues domestically, they need to ensure that they're factoring in the international extension, the digital trade extension of these sort of rules and regulations from the start. And that sort of, again, ties me back to the point I made before in ensuring that these countries, these small and medium-sized economies, may see these digital economy agreements as attractive because it helps them build the critical economies of scale in the global digital economy. Because in this vacuum, there's the lack of sort of clear guidance and rules from the WTO. And in that vacuum, there are ever-increasing number of barriers to digital trade. And so it's essentially fallen on these countries from the Asia-Pacific to lead the charge. And it's an area where the US used to lead the charge. And it's an area where sort of the US's absence has been obviously clearly missed. And I think that ties us back to your point about getting a clear understanding of the Biden administration's priorities and approaches. And I just have not seen any clear guidance that their focus of a worker-centric trade policy includes sort of these digital agreements and issues where it has such ready partners in the Asia-Pacific to work on. And so I think that'll be a key litmus test for the Biden administration as to whether they can sign up to these agreements, which sort of lend itself to the US's sort of leading position in the global digital economy, or whether it will sort of continue to fall upon these regional countries to work together to come up with new and innovative ways amongst themselves to govern sort of regional digital economic activity.
What's fascinating to me is the innovative approach to policy that we're seeing across the board in the Indo-Pacific. whether it's, it's an area where we have the most preferential trade agreements and a lot more in the pipeline. It's an area where you have the greatest density of global value chains under development. And now the digital economy with these sectoral agreements and new ideas coming out. And there's this linkage between the digital economy clearly and global value chains. It's synergistic, one stimulates the other and vice versa. Why? Why is that all happening in the Indo-Pacific? I think, Cory, you mentioned a little bit about this with the European approach to privacy, which is going to sort of slow this down. But why is this such a drive? I mean, there's no reason. I can't think of a reason why the accelerated activity is ongoing like it is in the Indo-Pacific. I'd love both of you to respond to that. Etel, do you want to start with that? Oh, you're muted.
Yep.
Please unmute.
Can you hear me? Since it's directly related to Cory's last comments, why don't you start and then I'll see if I need to add anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cory?
Yeah, no, I think it's an excellent question, right? Why is it that Japan, Singapore, and Australia and New Zealand are the ones that are leading the charge for these new rules? And I think it's a recognition that they need to step into the vacuum, that they need to provide the leadership and the vision on these issues, because quite frankly, they recognize that if they don't do it, no one else will. And so I have to give them a lot of credit for the fact that they've tried to step up and put this issue on both the global agenda and the regional agenda, because they, again, I think it comes back to their base recognition that unless they get ahead of these problematic policies, that their focus and engagement in trade in the future will be threatened. And so it's better that they take it upon themselves to try and potentially fail at coming up with new mechanisms and agreements and forums than to not try at all. And so I think you really are right. I mean, the Asia Pacific really is sort of a experimental test bed in this way. And it comes back to your point about the spaghetti bowl of preferential trade agreements. And that's obviously hardly ideal in terms of we'd obviously all want a sort of new multilateral sort of comprehensive deal at the WTO, but those days have come and gone. And so when it comes to these new and emerging issues, it's really incumbent upon small groups of like-minded and ambitious countries coming together to develop the model. And I think and this sort of brings me back to the point that if we trace back to the history of the comprehensive, the CPTPP, is that stemmed from initially a very small group of countries with New Zealand and Singapore and Brunei coming together, and that sort of stemmed into something much bigger. And I think that's what these same countries have in mind as they come up with these digital economy partnership agreements, is that they can sort of set the benchmark, see how it works, draw others into it in the hope that it will naturally grow and it will draw people into their model. And it's not, and in that way, it's a matter of attraction rather than coercion, as countries realize that this.
I think we may have lost Cory. Well, hopefully he'll come back right away. Etel, do you want to comment on some of the things that Cory?
Yes, I actually agreed with virtually every word he says. I wanted to add that China is another country that is exploiting that vacuum that you, Charles, were talking about at the very beginning, right? This absence of the US at the stage. But let's remember that the absence, this vacuum, was more pronounced than ever before during the Trump administration when all these things happened, right? And in particular, China, RCEP is very much a product of that, that opportunity that China took. But I want to explore a little bit, if I may, the issue of why this absence and your concerns that it may still be there to some extent. I think the Biden administration faces a very tough predicament regarding China and the region. But China in particular, all of you may have seen the recent Pew survey, the most recent Pew survey, that found that close to 90% of the public considers China as a competitor or an enemy, one of the two, not a partner. Furthermore, 70%, and you mentioned in your remarks the issue of whether human rights should or should not be part of the new presence, US presence. Well, 70% of Americans polled prioritize human rights even at the expense of economic relations. 53% favor, yes, getting tougher on China on trade issues, but here is something very interesting. 44% still favor a strong economic relationship with China. So, of course, public opinion resents cyber attacks and by China, and initial lack of transparency on COVID, hostility, on Hong Kong, Taiwan, neighboring countries in the South China Sea, and all the rest. However, when you disaggregate those numbers, there are huge partisan divides on the China blame game, with Republicans blaming China at a much higher rate for job losses, labeling China an enemy, supporting tariffs, and all the rest. Limiting China's power is in the top 5 priorities for Republicans, but ranks only number 12 for Democrats. I just wanted to lay out kind of what is the landscape at home that makes policy vis-a-vis the region so intractable at this time. And then there's the whole issue of Congress and so on, and more on that. But I think that's important to take into account when explaining the perceived continued absence of the US in the region.
Yeah, Cory, we're glad you're back. I don't know if you had some thoughts you wanted to complete.
No, well, I had the opportunity to practice my remarks in the interim until I figured out WebEx was frozen. But just to pick up exactly on Etel's point there and your earlier question, in that I think the reason why we've seen such leadership from the region with Singapore, Japan, and Australia is that they've recognized that there's a vacuum, in that if they don't do it, no one else will. And in this vacuum, there will be the spread of these China-like sort of restrictive approaches to new and emerging technologies and digital issues. And so it's incumbent upon them to set the rules there and to an experiment. And the analogy or the scenario that I look back to is the fact that the CPTPP stemmed from a smaller group agreement between New Zealand, Singapore, and Brunei and Chile that then grew. And I think that's very much what the Kiwis and the Singaporeans and Australians have in mind with these new digital economy partnership agreements, in that they will experiment and try and develop this new mechanism and hope that it attracts other like-minded, ambitious countries to join their approach, and that they recognize themselves that this approach sort of aligns with their domestic level approach of data governance and in digital regulation. And that stands in stark contrast to obviously China's approach, which lacks any sense of reciprocity in terms of digital economy market access, and Europe's approach, which prioritizes strict adherence to privacy, and that sort of limits its ability to engage in any sort of digital trade talks. Because the vast majority of countries, especially in the Asia-Pacific, will never meet those exacting standards. And so there is an opportunity for New Zealand, Australia, and Singapore and others to create a model to attract these countries in. But then that draws back to the central point. Where's the United States? These countries are obviously the United States sort of natural trading partners. And it's on an issue where the US used to lead, where US industry still does lead. And so we just haven't got any sense from the Biden administration that their worker-centric trade policy extends to these digital trade issues, where actually there's potential for sectoral agreements which may not make TPA's lapse a barrier to progress, in that there is potential there for the US to be engaged without having to go through the sort of the laborious process typically involved in a comprehensive trade agreement. That obviously still need to bring Congress along, but I know New Zealand, Australia, and Singapore have already been laying the groundwork up on the Hill. So it's hopefully a ready-made issue for the Biden administration to latch onto, and that in and of itself would send a strong signal to the region that that sort of the US is willing to engage in these sort of new forums and agreements and mechanisms.
Yeah, I think you raised. Go ahead, Etel.
No,
Go ahead.
if I may add just a word to all of that, due to all these factors, there seems to be increased regionalization of GVCs, but only to some extent, because regionalization of GVCs goes hand in hand with connections with the rest of the world. So there is always this debate between regional versus global, and I think all of it is happening together. It's not at the expense of necessarily. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, Cory, you made a really important point earlier about this vacuum due to the absence of the U.S. in the region economically. It didn't just happen recently. It's not a Biden phenomenon. It's not even a Trump phenomenon. It goes further back. And you mentioned the small countries that initiated the TPP. This was back during the Bush administration. However, George W. Bush and his administration and President Obama as well and his administration saw the need, which led to our negotiations over TPP. And then the withdrawal, of course, set us back a decade easily. And that now becomes the problem. So my concern now is that you have the Biden administration doing these reviews, and we're now almost 6 months into the administration. We don't even know what these reviews are going to recommend. The only one we've seen so far is the 100-day review, and most of the recommendations are very vague, very little mention of trade policy. It's really for enforcement, and they tend to equate worker-centric with organized labor as opposed to, more of a broad approach. And my concern is that this is just more protectionism on the part of the United States. And so with that, there's a question from one of our participants who is saying, do you think the regional countries will continue to be able to lead if the U.S. reemerges, or will they fall back more in line with the U.S. vision? Well, it's a big if about the U.S. reemerging, but maybe both of you could address this question, that if the U.S. does emerge, what do the other countries do? How do they react to this?
No, I think it's a big if, right? Where is the US? And I think the leading countries, Singapore, Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, will continue to continue in their leading roles. You have to give them a lot of credit for setting the vision and prosecuting it in the region, at the OECD, at the WTO, at the G20, in prosecuting sort of their interests as it relates to digital, in a way because they had to. Obviously, their ability to succeed would be greatly supported if the US was standing alongside them. And your ability to attract others to your model would be greatly enhanced if, in terms of market access commitments, the US was there amongst it. And so I think, to their credit, they've developed sort of the muscles for this, and that they'll continue to do it. But they would obviously be able to push harder and further if they had the US sort of leaning into it as well. But that's obviously a big if there. Everything is up in the air. I mean, I focus extensively on digital issues globally, and the Biden administration's main priority at the moment is the EU-US Privacy Shield negotiations. And there really has been a lack of any sort of signal as to how they will view digital issues more broadly, especially in the Asia-Pacific. But I can only hope that at the end of this review, that they recognize that obviously the services sector, the tech sector, and the increasingly data-dependent manufacturing and agricultural sectors all depend upon setting these new sort of rules in such a dynamic region, and that this should be an easy win. It really should be an easy win, but it depends on their priorities and how they want to prosecute it.
Etel, what do you think about the other countries and how they'll respond if the U.S. does re-engage?
I fully agree with Cory's position, but when we come to the question of where is the U.S., I just want to remind everybody that the U.S. as a state, maybe in terms of statecraft, trade agreements, all the things we've been discussing so far, may be not as present as some of us would like. but US corporations, okay, are fully there. I mean, my whole account of where we are on GDCs is there. Now, GDCs are 2/3 of account for about 2/3 of total trade now. That's a huge number, and it is dominated by lead firms from the United States. Now, that is the underbelly of all this growth and all these things that are happening, that thriving picture that Cory has been depicting and so on. And we shouldn't forget that.
Right. And to your point, I've read some other work on global value chains. There's increasing evidence about the inelasticity of global value chains. So once a company, let's say a large US multinational, sets up a global value chain, a complex, set of arrangements and contracts, those contracts are in place. It's very difficult to change all that. And there's the difficulty of finding, other suppliers that can meet the needs. So on one hand, you have the private sector, the US private sector out front on this, trying to drive this process, and a lot of US jobs connected to it. And on the other hand, you have a policy framework that is missing, or maybe perhaps even detrimental to what's going on. How do both of you think about your advice to companies in dealing with this type of uncertainty? What I'm sure you probably have inquiries from companies from time to time.
Every
What's
week.
your bottom line advice on how to deal with this policy uncertainty?
Actually, if I may, just so the chart on uncertainty that I brought up in one of my PowerPoints is basically a reflection of where firms are, right? They are in this dire predicament. But I also should mention that peak uncertainty peaked under the Trump administration. I have actually some statistics I could go back that I did mention on how firms became a lot more relaxed, even with the uncertainty that still goes on after the November elections. So there's no question that firms are, on the one hand, dealing that way from the sort of political context point of view. In terms of what are they doing, you mentioned the word elasticity, and that's actually a very important part of how they're coping with it. So actually, I'm working with a colleague, an economist from Japan. I'm not an economist, he is, on some of these issues. And we have a framework for estimating relative receptivity to resilience, to steps, to taking steps on resilience. So not everybody is equal in this world. And some firms actually have a lot more elasticity. There's we have six models of different firms in different sectors, and they vary in terms of their ability to adapt. But in the grand scheme of things, from what I can glean and from these surveys, it appears that there is a lot of adaptation going on. It's possible, a lot of adaptation going on, and again, under this sort of rubric of continued uncertainty, but nothing like the last 4 years. But one of the things that may explain some of the scarcities we see today actually has to do perhaps with the fact that they're adjusting, for instance, inventories, right? We were in a world of just in time. Now we're in a different world of creating inventories and so on. And that may be at least part of the reason why we see these scarcities. So whether we like them or not, we probably don't, but they may be a sign of ongoing adaptation that I believe is going on.
Yeah. Cory, please respond there, and also address the issue of what's the role of digital trade in creating these kinds of resilient supply chains.
Yeah, no, I was about to say, I think Etel's graph of uncertainty, if it was applied to the digital realm, would just constantly look like we're having an earthquake, because the the size and scope of changes in each of these countries is just constant. And I know that from talking to many tech firms around the world, especially in Southeast Asia, and that they're, to their credit, sort of engaging with local government officials in each and every case. And obviously USTR is obviously supporting them in some ways, but there's no overarching sort of framework or vision that the US government is pushing them to, and that it's largely incumbent upon the firms, trade associations, and these local countries recognizing that it's to their benefit to play a role in these GVCs. They may not be the home of leading firms in the GVCs, but they can play a role as a host for these firms, and recognizing that. And a clear example of that tension is in Vietnam. Obviously exhibits some of the same digital control concerns due to political and social concerns as China, but on the other hand, recognizes it needs open markets. And so it can't take the all-encompassing restrictive approach that China does. It has to be very selective, because it wants all of the foreign investment from ICT and other high-tech sectors, some of which have been displaced from China, to reside in Vietnam, but it recognizes that they require sort of a certainty as it relates to the use and transfer of data and digital technologies. And so I think some of these new agreements that are emerging and these data privacy and cybersecurity frameworks are providing some degree of certainty to these firms, that they know that they will be able to continue they will have this essential business function factored in to these evolving data governance frameworks in the future, so that they won't have the sudden shock of being cut off from the global digital economy as it relates to how their local operations tie into GVCs.
Why are these agreements necessary in terms of really protecting our national security, minimizing vulnerabilities within supply chains in the cyberspace? What's the role of these agreements, whether it's a comprehensive trade agreement with rules that are enforceable, or a sectoral digital agreement with rules that are enforceable? Explain your views as to why these are important, because businesses are caught trying to create supply chains. Oftentimes they can't determine who they're dealing with. There are layers and layers of that they would need to peel back. They don't have the capability to do that. So why is the framework necessary?
I think two key points, at least from my perspective. First, you have to recognize that from a digital supply chain perspective, US firms have essentially had to set up duplicative facilities in China for some time, and that will continue. The nature of the risk there and the legal uncertainty means that they have to essentially create an alternative system in China, which is essentially detached from the rest of the world. Second, as it relates to these digital trade agreements, I think at the basis of these agreements is the issue of trust, and of how they approach both risks and opportunities in the digital world. National security is a potentially very slippery slope as it relates to digital economy governance, because anything can be thrown in there. Like with data privacy, cybersecurity, you could say it's a national security issue, and essentially undermines any potential for open, rules-based global digital trade. And so I think Australia and others have recognized that they have to address these concerns very specifically, while allowing the vast majority of commercial digital activity to go ahead unimpeded. But that in that space, when it comes to ICT security, cyber security, that they will obviously take specific measures there, but that shouldn't come at the cost of the enormous economic potential elsewhere. And that's where each country is currently going through its process of deciding where it wants to land, including the Biden administration. And we've seen far more action from the Biden administration on national and cybersecurity than we have on digital trade. So where will they draw that line?
And yet, I wanted to follow up, Nigel, and yet you said, Australia was sort of more understanding of that, but Australia was one of the first countries that went on to support, the Huawei exclusion. So, and New Zealand was, very, very, so, but on the question of, your main question had to do with, again, sorry, I lost track of of Charles' initial question to you now. I got sidetracked on Australia. sort of Australia's predicament, you know, in this world that is emerging, right? Imports of trade agreement. Yeah. I mean, it all goes down really to the issue that President Obama was very explicit about this. You know, either you help create the rules of the road, right, that will place the U.S. in a privileged position to shape the reality out there, or you don't. So, you know, the dismissal of TPP as a possibility to, as a tool to advance that, is sort of a part of the reason we don't see that reality, and we see China now somewhat open to that, again taking taking the opportunities that are in front of it in the absence of a more forceful American presence there.
Well, we have about 3 minutes left. I want to give you both, you know, a brief opportunity to close out this discussion. Etel, what are your parting words here?
I'm going back to uncertainty, which you kind of very strongly kind of privileged in your remarks. We are in uncertain times, especially because you and I were talking right before the webinar about how to understand the 100 days review or report that just came out in front of our eyes. And that's because we don't see the actors yet responding to these initiatives. They're a mix of many things, some very good things on environmental issues and so on. Excellent things on enhancing transparency, something that we all should be setting we should be actually setting the rules for the rest to follow on enhancing not just first, second, third tier transparency on GVCs, but deeper than that. So there are many good things in there. We don't yet know how the political landscape will respond to all those things. And of course, there's Congress that will have a very important role to play on that. Thank you.
Nigel?
Yeah, final remarks is that the global economy will only become ever more digital. And I don't put much faith in e-commerce negotiations at the WTO coming out with really ambitious enforceable rules. So it's incumbent upon small groups of like-minded, ambitious countries coming together to try something new, to do things new. Because in that vacuum, new rules and restrictions will apply, which will undermine the basic sort of openness of the internet and the ability it plays in global value chains and production networks these days. And so it really is incumbent for trade officials like at USTR to break out of their silos, work with their privacy counterparts, work with their cybersecurity counterparts, their financial regulators and others, all of those who have sort of equities in these sort of new digital economy agreements, to figure out how they can play a role with like-minded partners in setting new rules and cooperation to support the role that data and digital technologies play in our economy.
Well, I want to thank you both for a very fascinating conversation on these two broad issues of vital importance. And we look forward to having an opportunity to revisit these issues as things are very dynamic and changing quite rapidly. So thank you again.
Thank you.
I will now turn things over to Ali Swalwinski, who is the Vice President for Research at NBR. Ali, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Charles. Really appreciate it. That was a really great discussion. Just to reiterate some fantastic points, and we're going to transition from talking about some of these broader themes to focusing a little bit more on some developments and perspectives from some of the region's kind of middle power countries. So it's it's my great pleasure to moderate this next panel, which is going to focus on India, New Zealand, and Taiwan, looking at their Indo-Pacific trade strategies and objectives, and trying to identify ways to better align policies and to touch on some of the points that our previous panel mentioned, to really increase cooperation of like-minded countries in the region. So we have three great speakers who will be touching on these issues. The first is Alan Ballard, who is a professor of practice at the School of Government, at the Wellington School of Business and Government, and the inaugural holder of the chair for Pacific Regional Business. He's also the New Zealand governor of the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. So we're really thrilled to have him with us here today. And we'll also hear from Arvind Panagariya, hopefully I didn't say it too poorly, who is a professor of economics and Indian political economy at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. His focus areas include international trade policy, economic development, and economic reforms with a focus on India. He is a former chief economist of the Asian Development Bank. It was also on the faculty of the Department of Economics at the University of Maryland, College Park. And then finally, we'll hear from Lotta Danielsson, who's the vice president of the US-Taiwan Business Council, where she's responsible for the day-to-day operations of the organization. Additionally, she's planned the annual US-Taiwan Defense Industry Conference, which serves as an important platform for bilateral dialogue on Taiwan's national security and defense needs. She previously has worked as a consultant and marketer for the Beijing Sun King Paper Company and has a wealth of experience working in Asia, Europe, and North America. So thrilled to welcome our three panelists here today. I didn't coordinate with them in advance about who wanted to go first. I read it in order of Alan, Arvind, and then Lotta. Does that work for you all? Sounds good. So if that sounds good, we'll turn it first to Alan.
Well, thank you very much, Ali, and great to be here, and good morning from winter's morning here in Wellington in New Zealand. When I was invited to speak on this panel, I saw this title, Competing Visions for Indo-Pacific Trade, and immediately that sparked off something quite different for me, because down under here, Indo-Pacific is quite a geopolitical term. It implies the Indian Ocean, it implies getting India into these trade movements. It's about the Quad, the 4 countries that have been involved in this, and it's about containing China. It's not particularly economic, certainly as far as New Zealand's concerned, also as far as Australia is, they're an Indian Ocean power. But it's quite a different sort of take on a lot of this, more geopolitical than economic. So to me, the term would be Asia Pacific, and by Asia, we generally mean East Asia. And of course, Australia and New Zealand, both big traders, both promoted free trade. You've heard that in the previous panel and continue to do that. And we've all certainly all been affected by anti-globalization, by the US-China tensions, by COVID and supply chain implications. Also something that hasn't been talked about so much, by more concern about climate change and what that means as well. And when I look at that from New Zealand and a little bit Australia's point of view, I'd say 2 things. One, multilateral, and the other more bilateral. New Zealand at the minute is hosting APEC, that's the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Organization. We've just had the trade ministers meeting. Those are the trade ministers for more than half the world's economy. It's the biggest regional organization of its sort. And New Zealand, in terms of hosting this and trying to guide it this year, is trying to reassert the need for free trade. And a lot of East Asia went through the Trump period and said, well, that's anti-globalization, but we actually want more free trade because we want more trade-driven growth, because we've got a lot of people who need to take advantage of that. New Zealand's also, however, trying to put a bit of a spin on inclusive trade, and that means paying much more attention to who's benefiting, who may not be benefiting, how you might improve that situation, how you might mitigate the burdens taken by people who feel they've been hurt by trade. And that's quite important in New Zealand. I'm not so sure it is in some of the other economies around the region. A lot of discussion about digital compatibility, and APEC is a non-legally binding organization. So it's a place where a lot of talk and incubation of ideas takes place. And the last couple of years, we've had a huge amount of discussion on digital. And just as the last panel said, quite different views around the table on all of that. And that is one reason why the smaller economies have got together to try and promote a particular modular approach to all of that. And then in addition, in APEC this year, quite a focus on COVID and supply chain disruption, PPE movement, vaccines, travel movements, and so a number of agreements about how to enhance movement around the region at a time of pandemic, how to enhance trade in vaccines, how to get tourism back working, how to get authorized travel arrangements for vaccinated people, all of those sort of things. There's, of course, for us in the region, two important other multilateral agreements, the TPP one and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership one. TPP, well, yeah, actually it came from the P3, P4 smaller countries. Then the United States jumped into it. We had a tough time negotiating with the United States, particularly on things like the pharmaceuticals industry. And when the US pulled out of it, it wasn't a complete surprise, because after all, they pulled out of the League of Nations, they pulled out of the International Trade Organization, they pulled out, it seems to be very hard to get congressional agreement, and has been for a long time, on a bunch of trade issues. And as trade partners and trade negotiating partners, we're pretty aware of that now when we go into a negotiation with the United States. So we were disappointed about that, but it has pushed ahead. And the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is quite interesting, because that's ASEAN taking a lead. And they're in the center of all of that. Now, they're not all naturally free traders, but on the other hand, they all do depend on trade for economic advancement. And of course, China's looking at that and saying, well, we'll lead that. And China's looking at possibly joining TPP, and that's all pretty interesting as well. I agree with all the comments in the previous panel about if there's a vacuum, especially a vacuum left by the US, China is ready to move into it. In addition, World Trade Organization, New Zealand, Australia, and other smaller economies are leading reform efforts within the WTO. We want to see it coming back into life. We do think it needs reform, but we do need to think it gets credibility and gets used for dispute resolution again. And so those are all examples of where these smaller economies are taking a lead, not necessarily because we want to, but sometimes it's easier for us to do that. We don't have all the conflicting interests that a big economy like the United States does. And at the minute, it looks to us like there is not much option. We need to do that and hope we can bring the United States along as well. But when we look bilaterally, it's a bit of a different story, because, and here actually, Australia and New Zealand are on different tracks at the minute, because the big bilateral economic relation isn't with the United States, it's with China. New Zealand's exports, 1/3 of them go to China, and the United States is only 1/3 as big as China in terms of our export markets, and Australia is something similar. Australia's been hit quite hard by the US-China tensions, and partly by its own domestic political response. It's now in a situation where China is punishing Australia in order to send a message to other trading partners about how it behaves with regard to China. And so there's a number of trade restrictions on things like as wide as barley, red wine, coal into China out of Australia, and there are big flows in those areas. Although China's been quite careful not to put import tariffs on something like iron ore, which they really need from Australia. So they're sending a message. Now, New Zealand had a bit of that about 20, 30 years ago when our Labor government banned nuclear warships from New Zealand waters, and the United States punished us at that stage, not because they particularly cared about New Zealand nuclear bans, but because they were sending a message to other countries that were more important, like Japan, on that. And we know how much that hurts. Australia's got a centre-right government. We've got a centre-left government in New Zealand at the moment. And we've actually been doing extremely well of very strong commodity prices. And much of that is due to China's handling of its COVID epidemic, and it's picking up very quickly at the moment. So there has been quite a lot of discussion about all of this. New Zealand, like Australia, Canada, US, and UK, is part of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing agreement. And recently, there was a bit of a breaking out of different views amongst the members, where the US was quite keen to use the Five Eyes arrangement as a way to send economic as well as geopolitical messages back to China. New Zealand said it wasn't comfortable with that. We want that to be an intelligence sharing agreement, but not an economic agreement. And we've said that we will continue to take our own view on China issues around human rights, for example, and we will continue to urge China to take account of those views, but we are trying to separate it out from economic trade policy in all of this. And we've yet to see how successful that will be. We're following, in a way, the ASEAN model in this. ASEAN countries have spent a very long period of time balancing out US security interests and economic China interests, and we can all learn from that. At the same time, New Zealand and Australia are pushing on bilateral matters with regard to underway and upcoming free trade agreements with the UK and the EU. And we're really focused also on one other issue, which is we've closed down during COVID. We've been described as the kindest little hermit kingdom in the world. It's time for us to find some way of opening up. And that's quite difficult because actually we're having a lot of trouble getting hold of vaccines, as is Australia at the moment. I'll stop at that point. Thank you.
Great. Those are some great themes I'm hoping we can return to after our other presenters. And of course, as our audience members have questions for our presenters, please go ahead and send those. You don't have to wait until all three presenters have completed. You can go ahead and send them to events@nbr.org. So with that, I will turn it over to Arvind. You're still muted, sir.
Thank you, Ellie. All right, so if I were to actually take seriously the Asia-Pacific view of the subject for today, I suppose India should not be here. So I have to return to the Indo-Pacific so that India is actually here. But to get a little bit of continuity with the previous panel, just a couple of points I want to make before I come to India. First, I think, all said and done, we spent a lot of time on digital trade and the rules governing that trade in the opening panel. But the fact remains that merchandise trade still remains the dominant form of trade. So you got about 18 to 19 trillion dollars worth of merchandise trade versus total commercial services trade being about $6-7 trillion. So that trade still remains the dominant form of trade. Now, it may not matter much in the context, perhaps, because one could argue that, well, the rules there are already well set, and it is really digital trade, which is relatively new, and that is why the need is to focus on the rules governing digital trade, except that, in fact, the institution that has really governed merchandise trade for the last almost 70 years, the World Trade Organization and its predecessor, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, is having serious difficulties. Right now, I don't think it has impacted trade flows very much. And as I think Etel had said earlier, that the companies are very much present there. And so even if the countries are not present, and especially this was in the context of the United States being absent on the scene of rulemaking, the presence of companies really sort of partially or substantially substitutes for that. That is perhaps true in the short run, but I really think that if WTO really continues on the current trajectory, eventually the impact on trade will follow. There is a lag in these matters, but the very fact, for example, that the dispute settlement body pretty much has become dysfunctional, which means that any of the agreements that have to be enforced and simply cannot be enforced. that does actually encourage countries to therefore violate, and especially because the United States hit the opening shot on this one with steel and aluminum tariffs. It really opens the floodgate of protectionism on the part of the other countries. It hasn't done the kind of damage that is potentially possible, but it can still happen. So I think there is something to be done there. The United States really is the demander country in a way, because a lot of the issues that are plaguing the WTO today are US-centric issues. Even a lot of the US-China issues are at the WTO are US issue in terms of the, who is demanding the change. And yet the US really has not put forth a proposal as to exactly what it would like the WTO, how it would like the WTO rules to change, particularly with respect to the dispute settlement. Some change will have to happen, but I think that really is something that requires a bit of attention. One had hoped that, after Biden administration came in, we'll see some movement there. But I mean, I realize that the concerns are pretty much across the aisle. Both they don't have to do with the differences between the Republican and Democratic sides, but nevertheless, at least in terms of style, and these were kind of issues coming from what President Trump raised. He put it more aggressively and more directly, but certainly these were issues that were very much recognized under President Obama first, and continue to be recognized by the current administration. But perhaps in terms of style, one had hoped that there'll be some movement, some change, but so far not very much. And I think for countries like India and others, WTO really is quite critical. So that's the first kind of set of remarks I wanted to make. Now, turning to India, in terms of trade, perhaps India today is not still all that very important. Its share in merchandise trade is probably something like 2% of the GDP. In imports, perhaps closer to 3%. Of the global trade. Services, it's maybe 3 to 4% of the global trade, so not a very large player, but it is important looking ahead. So today it is a $3 trillion economy, fifth largest, following the United States, China, Japan, and Germany. By 2030, I think it will be the third largest. Under the current trajectory, it has been growing. There have been ups and downs, but if I average out last 17 or 18 years since 2003, it has been growing at about 7% plus annually. So at that kind of rate, it is going to be a sizable economy by 2030, because now the base is large. For the last 15 years, as it has been growing, it started with a relatively low base, but approximately $3 trillion is a respectable base on which to grow, and with 7%, it is going to get important. So that is the main importance. Now, on trade side, nevertheless, India has been relatively protectionist if you compare it to the other countries in the region or globally. There was a big spurt in liberalization until about 2000, 2008. This was all done on a unilateral basis, so it was not through free trade agreements, to which I will return in a minute. But it sort of did liberalize quite considerably. Simple average of all tariff rates came down to about 8.9% by 2010. But there has been creeping protectionism in the last several years, and particularly under the current administration. And so the simple average of tariff by 2021 has now gone up to about 11.1%. And a lot of tariff peaks in there, from something like, in 2010, only about 12% of the tariff rates were higher than 15%. Today, more than 25% are are more than 15%, which is quite high, for a quarter of the tariff lines. And often, these higher tariff lines are the ones where where the impact is largest. You protect where you import more, and so the impact of that, those quarter of the tariff lines is much more. So that has been one of the worries, and a lot of my job in battling the government against protectionism. But in the present government, there is clearly a lot of old style thinking, import substitution, and so that has obviously contributed to the growth in international trade also. I mean, for a while, trade had grown very, very rapidly, but that seems not to be the case now. And of course, currently, COVID has naturally impacted everybody, except perhaps China. Although the recovery globally has been quite remarkable, and then the WTO is predicting 8% growth in 2021. Even the decline in 2020 actually globally was only about 5.3% according to the WTO, compared with about 12% after the global financial crisis in 2009. So India's major trading partners are the United States, European Union, ASEAN, and China. And particularly in terms of India importing, it is very, China is the largest partner as far as imports are concerned. On the export side, it is the United States. Now, free trade agreements is where probably India is one of the countries which has made the least use of. It really doesn't have any, it's not a member of any of the major big trade agreements. It's perhaps, the two most, two countries with which it has, trade agreements are Japan and South Korea. It also has one with ASEAN, but I think with ASEAN it is done under the enabling clause as opposed to under Article 24. So it's a little bit weaker. But other than that, India was very much in discussions on RCEP, but unfortunately, it pulled out. Now, I was very strong supporter of India going into RCEP, but on that, I'm afraid I have changed my mind after the India-China border skirmishes that happened last August in Galwan Valley. Simply, I came to the conclusion that the geopolitics really overruled the trade relations, and in effect, in the end, can India trust China? China here meaning, the Communist Party and the PLA. And then at least my conclusion was that it really couldn't be trusted. And so India has begun to move away from China, not in any kind of protectionist way through wholesale tariffs and so forth, but it has taken a few actions on some of the apps, including TikTok, which was the most visible one. It has also excluded Huawei from bidding for 5G network in India. And so where India is headed now, I have been advocating since the Galwan Valley events that it should really, if it really wants to distance itself from China, then it has to do it by not erecting barriers against China, but lowering the barriers against some of the other trading partners. And those are the United States, European Union, and United Kingdom. I think they'll have to start, which they have announced that they are starting, European Union and United Kingdom. That's where they're exploring first. With the US, agriculture is a major issue because US is very competitive in agriculture. India is not so easy, so willing to open its market for agriculture, largely because Indian agriculture consists of incredibly large number of very, very small farms. So politically, it is a difficult call for India. But that's where the matters stand. So we will see what negotiations happen with the European Union and with the United Kingdom. So let me stop there and we can take up some of the issues later on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And finally, we'll turn it over to Lotta.
Thank you so much, Ali. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I spend most of my time during the day working on US-Taiwan relations pretty much exclusively. So it's great to have this more holistic view of the Indo-Pacific. So I appreciate all the prior comments. I wanted to sort of set the stage a little bit for where Taiwan is right now. So Taiwan has had a very successful economy in 2020 and 2021. Its handling of COVID in 2020 really was remarkable. Of course, they've since had some setbacks, but that coupled with local demand and export growth, fantastic export growth for Taiwan, especially in their flagship technology sector, has meant that their economy is going gangbusters. In fact, in 2020, the GDP growth for Taiwan outpaced China for the first time in 30 years, which is, a huge point. I don't think that that's going to continue, but growth for the first part of this year looks pretty good. Of course, the outlook for the second half of 2021 is a little bit more uncertain based on the COVID outbreak. For Taiwan, China obviously is a dominant player. China, the US, and Japan are the top 3 trading partners for Taiwan. But in 2020, China basically held 26% share of overall trade for Taiwan, which is huge. So the trade dependency, particularly on the export side, continues to grow there. Taiwan has a trade agreement in effect from 2010, the ECFA. But it's really hard for Taiwan to have trade discussions when really the other side, that being China, refuses to talk. And that's been the case since President Tsai took power in Taiwan in 2016. But Taiwan is trying to live up to its ECFA promises, even though they're not really talking to China much these days. As we've heard in the first panel, we're seeing a lot of changing investment and trade flows when it comes to China, and that's true for Taiwan as well, especially for Taiwan businesses to shifting investments out of China. A lot of them are shifting their investments, and some of them are taking their high-level technologies and going home. So we're seeing a huge amount of investment back into Taiwan. But there's an increased interest in Southeast and South Asia as well. And I saw some trade statistics that came out today that said that out of the companies that are bringing investments out of China, about the 55% are bringing them home to Taiwan, whereas 36% is bringing them out to the ASEAN countries. And so that's kind of interesting. And that really plays into where Taiwan is today when it comes to trade policy. Really focusing on this new southbound policy, which is Taiwan's policy on trying to reduce reliance on China by looking to the south and east and as well to India. This is not the first time that Taiwan has really tried to do a Go South policy. President Lee had the Go South policy in 1994. President Chen had his own Go South policy in 2002. And of course, President Ma, when he was very focused on China, but he did sign a trade deal with both New Zealand and Singapore in 2013. But the current new southbound policy has sort of a broader scope, I think, than the other prior ones. My comments are generally on trade and investments because that's kind of what we're talking about, but it really goes beyond commerce and emphasizing people-to-people relationships, education, cultural and talent exchanges, tourism, and so on. So the NSP policy is for 18 countries. It's primarily in the ASEAN, a smattering of South Asia, and then New Zealand and Australia as well. But of course, Taiwan cannot focus on 18 economies all at once. So really the major focus and the priority is for India, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia. And we've seen a modestly successful policy so far. We've seen a small increase, a 13% increase in trade between Taiwan and the NSP countries since 2016. And that is comparison to about negative 13% between 2012 and 2016. And so they've been quite successful in the ASEAN, but maybe less so with others in South Asia. They all have decreased trade with other countries in South Asia, with the exception of Nepal, actually. And just to take India as an example, trade with India has decreased by 4% since 2016, despite the NSP and despite India being a quite complementary partner for Taiwan. The Taiwan government has had some successes in the new southbound policy. They signed a bilateral investment agreement with the Philippines. They have some upgraded versions of BIAs with India and Vietnam. And they've also done quite a few MOUs on things like trade cooperation and fair market access. But in addition to that, we've also seen quite a few successful business-to-business partnerships as part of the new southbound policy push, and that includes in biotech and healthcare, especially over the last year or so, infrastructure, and then technology and finance. And so I do see that we will have Taiwan focus on South and Southeast Asia will continue. Of course, they're also the focus of Taiwan and trying to sort of do a more global regional approach. They are blocked out from the RCEP, obviously, because it's led by China. And so they're trying very hard to prepare to join the CPTPP. In December of 2020, they said they are in the process of evaluating their application, and they're doing the pre-consultations that they need to do with all the 11 members. And of course, they're paying very close attention to what the UK are doing right now, because the UK joining process started just earlier this month. There are lots of obstacles for Taiwan, obviously China being the big one. They had discussions with Australia on an FTA that was derailed by Chinese pressure in 2016. They have some discussions with Japan, but those were also derailed largely due to protectionist policies, particularly on agricultural imports based on the Fukushima disaster. But yet we're seeing support for Taiwan joining the CPTPP from both Japan and Australia. And Taiwan is really trying to prepare to join a high standards trade agreement. They're making their own regulatory and policy changes and so forth. And they continue to talk to Japan, to the US, to New Zealand and others on trade. And obviously they're talking to the United States. The TIFA talks were held today. Really interesting that's the first time since 2016. I haven't had a chance to really read up on what the outlook is of that yet. But they talked about vaccines, they talked about medical equipment, they talked about a variety of different issues that I think is going to be very interesting to see where they end up with that. Now, we're hoping to continue to see talking from Taiwan and the United States, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention sort of our pet project, which is the US-Taiwan BTA, or an FTA with Taiwan. We feel that having the United States step in and do an agreement would allow other countries in the region to take the steps forward, and it provides cover for agreements with its regional partners. And so that's kind of where we're at. But again, I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Lotta. So I'm going to turn to a few questions now, some that'll be kind of for each of you to kind of grapple with your respective countries, and some that are a little more specific to some of the comments that are country specific that you've made thus far. But to kind of kick it off, I wanted to ask for each of you for you to reflect in terms of kind of what your country's visions and priorities are that you've kind of outlined in terms of their trade priorities. What do you think is the single most or one most important factor that would determine the level of success for your country in advancing this set of priorities that you've laid out over the next few years? There's a lot of changes going on in the region, a lot of dynamics that could be at play. So what do you all think is the kind of top priority, important factor? Oh, sorry. Yeah, let's go in order.
New Zealand's easy. Our top priority is agricultural trade liberalisation. When we hear about these FTAs, most of them are focused on manufactured goods. We've already heard quite a bit of discussion about how that is moving into services, especially digital, but agricultural sectors are heavily protected in the region, and we've made very limited progress ever since the Uruguay trade round, which is the time of the first push. So that's a long time ago. So that's pretty clearly what New Zealand's looking for.
Okay. on India, you know, there are two ways to address the question. What should be the priorities and what will be the priorities? I think what should be the priorities is to liberalize trade. I think this whole turn towards import substitution has been wrong. It'll hurt the country. What would be, I think, more likely, India is going to now try to force free trade agreements with the European Union and United Kingdom. It's a tough ask, but I think that's something that is in the works, on the cards. So hopefully that will happen. In terms of priority for India, and slightly differently, looked at slightly differently, is to also attract a lot of the foreign investors to its shores. There is a lot of talk of it is underway, diversification away from China and into other countries. So far, India has received some of it, but I think the scope for India is just enormous there, for the simple reason that wages in virtually all other countries in the region, whether it's China or it is South Korea or it is Taiwan, are much higher, significantly higher. Only competing countries perhaps would be something like Vietnam or Bangladesh, but again, the labor pool in these countries is still relatively small. So it is only India which has a very large labor pool, greatly underemployed, and so these low wages can stay for quite a while. So I think it is really a good destination from that perspective, and that's where at least some of the domestic economic policy reform can focus on.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned some of it. I think a BTA with the US is one of their primary priorities. Getting trade talks restarted in general was important for them. Hopefully that will continue over the next several years as the Biden administration and the Tsai administration work on the TIFA talks. Investment as well in Taiwan, trying to bring some of their companies home. This is something that they've really put a huge amount of effort into, and they have several 100,000 jobs and large amounts of investments coming back from outside, and that's something that Taiwan's government has really focused on. But then again, so I would say the top three is bringing more investments home, the BTA and trade talks with the US, and then of course the CPTPP, which is probably one of their major things that they're wanting to try to do.
And to pick up on a point that Alan made at the during his comments, actually towards the end of them, about the impact or the signal being sent by China recently in its restrictions on barley, wine, and coal for Australia, that China is sending a message to other trading partners, particularly those in the region, with those restrictions, and that Australia is certainly grappling with this now. Be curious to hear from each of our participants, and in the case of New Zealand as well. So how is that message, that signal, being received, and what do you think are there opportunities or possibilities for countries in the region to respond in different ways that may not require them to necessarily receive it the way that China intends it to be received? This is kind of to pick up on some of the themes at the tail end of the previous panel about how countries might, like-minded countries might respond to this type of economic pressure. Let's go in reverse order to shake it up a little bit. So Lotta.
Sure. Well, it's interesting to see China has really, and obviously Taiwan deals with Chinese pressure every day. If it's, planes flying through their air defense identification zone, whether it's them trying to basically pressure the Taiwan government and the Taiwan populace by basically stopping to buying pineapples. Like they decided, oh, we're not going to buy any pineapples from Taiwan anymore. There's some of those things happening on a daily basis. I think the pineapple issue is quite interesting because the way that Taiwan sort of responded to that was by everybody in Taiwan buying freedom pineapples, right? So the actual export that was supposed to go to China, all of that went to local consumption as well as to other partners in the region and across the globe. And we see that not just with that particular issue, but also on things like tourism, where China basically said, oh, we're going to stop doing tourism. Well, Taiwan really basically pivoted and went to other countries around the region to try to increase their tourism. And so they were offsetting those types of things. I do think that Taiwan is an interesting, place to look at for these types of things. And maybe not everybody can buy pineapples in Japan and New Zealand and India, but it really is that there are other ways to move forward where you don't allow China to really put the pressure on there, and continue to work with your partners in the region and across the globe is helping offset those types of pressures. And I think that's a good experience from Taiwan.
Okay, so India's position from this perspective is a peculiar one, because it is the one that is taking more actions against China rather than the other way around, and this ties into issues of security and all. So it has banned quite a large number of Chinese apps. It excluded, as I mentioned, Huawei from 5G. Also, as it turns out, India has a very large trade deficit with China. So China exports a lot to India. India doesn't export a whole lot to China. So to some degree, I think, bilaterally, China is not in a position to inflict a big trade injury on India. In contrast, India can actually inflict a significantly larger injury on China because of this large bilateral trade deficit. So it's a little different from most of the other countries in the region.
And from New Zealand's point of view, we've had quite a difficult trading relationship with China in the past. For example, in the dairy sector, it's been very difficult due to some local issues. And kiwi fruit, most recently, there's been big court cases relating to China taking New Zealand intellectual property illegally, and in some other areas as well. But in the past, these have mainly been about issues with state-owned enterprises or provincial governments. What we're seeing now is national government doing it, and sort of wolf warrior diplomacy in a way being extended to include economic sanctions. And we don't like that, and it's very difficult to deal with. On the other hand, we are very aware that the United States is out there putting out financial sanctions on things it doesn't like, and technological sanctions on Huawei and others as well. So when you're in a small country, it's a complicated world, and you deal with it as you can. And once again, I'd say we can learn quite a lot from the way the ASEANs have dealt with those dual pressures as well, not always successfully, but it's part of their life, and more we're seeing it in Australia and New Zealand as part of our life. The Australian domestic political scene is a bit different, and that's leading to a number of Australian ministers coming out with quite strong statements about Australian nationalism, and without particularly worrying about the impact on China. So we don't want to be in that situation in New Zealand if we can avoid it. But as I say, it's complex.
Great. So be interested to hear, to build a little bit on the theme of, well, Alan mentioned that smaller countries are having some success in multilateral fora like APEC, and in pushing forward some proposals for WTO reform to achieve some of their objectives in those spaces. what could some of the smaller countries, or the major powers, if we look at the US and China trying to shape the region in terms of their preferences, so even if it's not some of the smaller powers but middle powers as well, what could these countries be doing a better job in terms of working together, either multilateral fora or in more ad hoc style, to achieve their objectives? Since I've had both Alan and Lotta go first already, Arvind, if you have any comments.
Okay. Yeah, that's a very tough one. I would say that all of us have to persuade the US to come to the table and put its demands as to, what will it really take for it to, step by step restore the working of the WTO, and in particular, I think dispute settlement body, because it's the US which has simply refused to accept any of the appellate body judges, so that we are now down to only 2 left, and therefore there is no quorum. So that's certainly one thing. What India has done as a country is they have actually led the proposal on TRIPS waiver on vaccine patents, which has garnered a fair bit of support. So that is the other role that India has played, and that's one example. But in the end, I think, without the US playing, I see not enough space for the other countries to actually pull off some of the key on some of the key issues.
Lotta?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of sort of a bipolar world where China is on one side and the US is on the other, and people take sides against each other, I think is not an ideal way for the future to go. And we talked about a lot about sort of the bifurcation of supply chains that we heard was, Etel, I think, said that it was not really happening, but that's something that we need to keep an eye out on. And then I just think that there's a lot to be done for countries that are not China or the US to really work together to talk and to work through the mechanisms that are already there, through the WTO, through the APEC, through some of the other, New Zealand and Taiwan have a free trade agreement. There's something they can do there to move forward on some of the issues that are both of them have interest in. So working together, I think, is going to be key. Obviously, that's a very difficult thing to do, but and again, having the US sort of step in and lead, I think, is going to be an important part as well.
Alan?
Yeah, I mean, small countries have always been involved in these big agreements. The Cairns group was terribly important with the Uruguay round. As you've heard, the P4 were really the pioneers of the TPP. And currently, there's a number of small country initiatives trying to push WTO along and APEC and so on. But it's sort of easier in small countries quite often because, on the one hand, we tend to be more reliant on international trade. Secondly, we may not have all those complex political interests and economic interests that one finds in the bigger countries like that. We could work better together. It'd be nice to see ASEAN countries giving more of a lead in this in principle, and from a rhetoric point of view, they're doing that through RCEP. But there's always been a bit of a gap between ASEAN rhetoric and ASEAN actual accomplishments. A few years ago, it looked like a bunch of these South American or Latin countries were giving some leadership in this. There's particularly the Pacific Alliance, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile. Unfortunately, since COVID and some other things, that's gone very quiet, but they were out there leading in a number of interesting ways for a while. And I mean, we heard the first panel, it basically says the US has an opportunity here. At the minute, the Chinese are looking at the US and saying that is Donald Trump with better manners. And we are looking at it as well and saying something similar, but it could be a lot more than that. We understand there's very big domestic interests, but at the minute it looks like they're really just taking the lead, and there isn't that urgent focus on international issues, even though it is a point of a time of real possibilities for the United States.
Great. I think that was really nice bringing together of points that the three of you kind of concurred and agreed on there, which is a good stopping point, I think, for our discussion here today. We're just about at time. So I want to thank our speakers, our panelists, so much for their insightful remarks, and to all of our audience members for attending. I would also encourage anybody that wants to look further into some of these issues to check out our website at nbr.org. We will have commentaries related to these issues and from previous events and publications that we've put on the website there, and I encourage you guys to take a look at that. So thank you once again to our panelists here from panel 2, our panelists from speaking earlier, and to all of our participants. We really enjoyed the conversation and hope everybody has a great day.